Hello everyone, Professor Kurzlik here. So in our last video, we introduced liberalism as one of the major theoretical traditions in international relations. So in our next video for our series on introduction to international relations, I wanted to make a video about the democratic peace theory. So in our previous video, we discussed how liberal thinkers tend to be more optimistic than realists about the possibility of progress when it comes to world politics. So just a reminder, when we hear terms like liberal and when we think of liberal, this isn't the domestic politics sense of liberal. This is the international relations theory perspective of liberalism and liberal in that perspective. So not Bernie Sanders, not Elizabeth Warren, in the IR sense. And in the IR sense, we are looking at liberalism and realism and constructivism and feminism. So we talked about that in liberalism, there's this idea of through institutions, progress in world politics can be achieved as a way to mitigate, not completely eliminate, but at least mitigate conflict. And as we talked about, that does not mean liberals believe that conflict will simply disappear or that states behave morally. Instead, as we learned, liberalism argues that the way that states are organized internally, the institutions they participate in, and the economic relationships they build can shape how they behave internationally. Really the bedrock, the hallmark of liberalism. And as we brought up in our previous video, one of the most important ideas to come from this liberal tradition, from liberalism, is the idea of the democratic peace theory. So again, as we work through our introduction to international relations video series, I wanted to make a video about the democratic peace theory because it's such a big piece of liberalism, of this section of international relations scholarship. So really, at its simplest, the democratic peace theory argues that democracies are highly unlikely to go to war with one another. Remember, with liberalism, regime type matters. Realism, not so much. Many realist scholars say it doesn't matter if it's a democracy or an authoritarian regime. What matters to realists is the state and power. But liberalism, liberal scholars argue that regime type does matter. And one of the reasons, if we're looking at democratic peace theory, is because democracies are less likely to go to war with one another. Again, as we talked about last time, this does not mean, and this does not say, that democracies are peaceful in general and democracies never go to war. We know. We just look around the world. We know that democracies do fight wars. Democracies have fought colonial wars, intervention wars, counterinsurgency wars, and wars against authoritarian or non-democratic states. So liberal scholars say, yes, of course, still conflict in the world. The narrow claim, though, is that stable liberal democracies almost never fight full-scale wars against other stable liberal democracies. So that makes democratic peace theory one of the most famous, and we can imagine and understand, most debated claims in international relations theory. If it is right, then regime type really does matter. The domestic political structure of states is not just an internal matter then. It affects international security And this is really where the theory fits directly in with liberal internationalism from our last video. Liberal internationalism is built on the idea that peace can be strengthened through liberal political institutions, of course, international law, as we talked about, open markets, representative democracies, representative governments, and international organizations. Where realism tends to begin with anarchy and insecurity and power competition, liberalism instead asks whether certain political and economic arrangements can actually reduce the likelihood of war. Thus, this theory gives one answer. The spread of liberal democracy may create a more peaceful international order, at least among the democracies themselves. So, the roots of this idea are often traced back to Immanuel Kant and his essay Perpetual Peace. Kant argued that peace would be more likely among states with republican forms of governments. Again, respect for law and cooperative relations with one another. Modern democratic peace theory updates that logic in an empirical form. Rather than simply saying that democracies is more desirable, it asks, and modern liberal scholars ask, whether democratic political systems actually produce different patterns of international behavior. So building off of that theory of Immanuel Kant and putting into empirical practice. So our textbook that we've been using for this theory connects this argument to Michael Doyle, one of the major modern figures associated with democratic peace theory. Doyle argued that modern liberalism has produced two legacies. The first is the pacification of relations among liberal states. Liberal democracies, according to this view, have created a separate zone of peace among themselves. The second legacy, the author argues, is more troubling, that liberal democracies may exercise restraint toward one another while still finding reasons to use force against non-liberal or non-democratic states. So that second point is crucial for students to understand. And one of the criticisms you hear about this theory from scholars, practitioners, and sometimes even the general public themselves when they are engaging in foreign policy discussions. So democratic peace theory is not the same as saying democracies are completely innocent. A democratic state can still invade, coerce, sanction, occupy, or, of course, intervene in other states. The United States, Britain, France, and other democracies have all used military force abroad. Just turn on the news and you see this. The democratic peace claim, though, we know is more specific. Democracies appear to treat other democracies differently than they treat non-democracies. Again, turn on the news, read the newspapers, see where conflict is occurring around the world that the U.S. is involved in. Democratic peace theory says this makes sense. Democracies are still forceful against non-democracies, but when we look at Iran, we look at terrorist organizations that the U.S. is engaged in, such as Hezbollah. Theorists of the democratic peace theory said this makes sense. These are not democracies. So, okay. So this does raise the question then So why democracies avoid war with one another? Why do democracies not go to war with one another? There are several explanations for this, and scholars have laid out competing ideas, or at least maybe not competing, but at least different ideas of why, and there's definitely some overlap. So the first is institutional explanations. Democracies have elections and legislatures, opposition parties, courts, media, public debate, public pressure on elected officials. These institutions can make it harder for leaders to rush into war. If a democratic leader wants to fight another state, that leader may have to persuade voters, deal with legislative oversight, face media scrutiny, and accept the risk of being punished in the next election, punished at the ballot box. We know war is costly, and democratic publics often bear those costs through taxes, casualties, and social disruption. Think about what we are experiencing around the world right now with the conflict in the Middle East, with the Strait of Hormuz closure, rising gas prices, inflation's emerging, economies are suffering. So democratic peace theory says because elected officials are accountable for these problems, war is less likely, especially against democracies. So because democratic leaders are accountable to citizens, they may be more cautious about starting wars, especially against other democracies, where compromise seems possible and more likely. So the second explanation is the normative explanation. Democracies are built around norms, peaceful competition, compromise, bargaining, lawful opposition. Political opponents are not supposed to be treated as enemies to be destroyed. They're supposed to be treated as legitimate rivals. Democratic peace theory suggests that democracies may externalize these norms when dealing with one another. If democratic governments see each other as legitimate, as bound by law, they may be more willing to negotiate disputes rather than settle them through force. So this does not always apply to how democracies view non-democracies, though. Liberal democracies may see authoritarian regimes as illegitimate, dangerous, aggressive, or oppressive. That can make conflict more likely. This is why the theory is sometimes described as a dyadic theory, not simply a monadic theory. Yeah, read those in the textbook. Okay, so a third explanation is the economic and interdependence explanation. And I'll probably make another video just on this aspect as the final piece of our liberalism series. Liberal democracies often have market economies and dense trade relationships. When countries trade heavily with one another, war becomes costly or more likely, or more unlikely, excuse me, because war is becoming more costly. War would, of course, disrupt markets, would disrupt investments, supply chains, and financial relationships. This does not mean trade always prevents war, but liberal theorists argue that economic interdependence can create incentives for restraint against conflict. If two democracies are also deeply tied through trade, through alliances, international organizations, the cost of war becomes even higher, and in theory, even less likely to occur. So this is where democratic peace theory connects to the broader liberal internationalist idea. Liberalism does not usually rely on one mechanism alone. It often links to, as we've been saying, democracy, institutions, laws, and commerce together. Democracies are expected to be more peaceful with one another, partly because they share these norms with each other. So when we think about this in practice, we can think about the post-World War II order, something that we've been hearing a lot about in the news. We've heard a lot about the breakdown of the post-World War II order, the breakdown of the post-World War II norms. So following the Second World War, the United States, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, and other democratic states became tied together through alliances, through unified trade institutions. So from the liberal perspective, this was not just a balance of political power system, like maybe realists would point to. It was a liberal order, a set of relationships built around democracy, around markets, around law, and of course around institutions. So we know that realists are critical of this because they're thinking about power. There is also a Marxist critique, though, or a political economy critique. A Marxist critique, as our textbook points out, a Marxist might argue that peace among liberal democracies reflects the interests of capitalist elites and a transnational economic order. So in this Marxist interpretation, major capitalist democracies avoid war with one another because they benefit from preserving the same global economic system, the same global economic order. Peace, they argue, is not necessarily produced by democracy. It is produced by the shared interests of dominant economic actors. Our textbook presents this as another plausible but not conclusive challenge to the democratic peace theory. So, as I brought up in our previous video on liberalism, there is also the problem, a bit of a definitional problem. What counts as a democracy? What counts as a war? How democratic does a state need to be? Do we include young democracies or unstable democracies, maybe partial democracies? Or are they only talking about consolidated liberal democracies? These questions matter, not just for categorization, but also because the theory can look stronger or weaker depending on how we define these key terms. For example, if two states have elections but weak rules of law, and they have high corruption and maybe limited civil liberties, should they count as liberal democracies? Democratic peace theory is strongest when it focuses on stable, consolidated liberal democracies. Not every country that holds elections. In our comparative politics courses, we learn about just because a country holds elections doesn't mean they're necessarily a democracy. So this is an important distinction because liberal democracy, we know, is more than just voting. It's about constitutional limits, civil liberties, of course, that rule of law, peaceful transfer of power, and protection of opposition rights. So another important complication is of democratic transition. Some scholars argue that states moving towards democracy may be especially unstable. Leaders in transactional systems may use nationalism, external threats, or military conflict to consolidate power. So even if a country is a stable democracy and they rarely fight with each other, democratizing democratizing states may not be peaceful in the short run. So we can see what is thought of as a pretty simplistic and a pretty straightforward theory. When we dig into it a little bit deeper, the empirical evidence shows a far more complex picture of, okay, the democracies may be less likely to go to war, but what is a democracy? How do we categorize a democracy? And then we see that democracies still go to war against non-democracies, against authoritarian regimes, wars of prevention. So we can see that the democratic peace theory at the outset on the surface seems straightforward, but when we dig in deeper, it is a bit more complicated. So thank you for watching, and I'll make another video about interconnected economies because that's another important piece of liberalism. Thank you.